the ability to spin up a company, to spin up a startup, there's just really minimal things that need to happen. There aren't huge barriers to entry. And, this has long been a complaint, certainly in other sectors, but in other parts of the world, right?
Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. In this season of Cut Your Learning Curve, we're sponsored by Swarm, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. Cool. So we're taking this season to talk a lot about the future of work and a lot of the sort of changes that are happening kind of in the world at large around. We didn't start out doing things related to the quarantine, but it turns out a lot of these topics are very topical because of how people are working differently these days. And today we decided to tackle the topic around what is life like inside of a tech startup. So our question is, what is different about working inside of a technology startup versus another organization? And what are the pros and cons? So Eve.
So Nate and I often try to sort of check in advance of these sessions and sort of, toss the football around in terms of some of these ideas. And so something that surprised me a little bit was Nate is CEO of Swarm, an agency here in New York City. And I was really surprised that he does not consider Swarm to be currently a tech startup. So I'd be interested in hearing why you think that.
Yeah, I guess it kind of just goes to what the definition of a tech startup is. We work in technology, so there are some overlaps. And I think that there's definitely ways in which, since I'm new to Swarm, that we're operating as a startup. But, I was thinking about it earlier. There's a book I'm reading right now where they said that IBM is becoming the biggest employer of designers on the planet, and that's their goal, where they're kind of shifting their focus. And even though IBM hasn't traditionally been in that arena, we don't think of them as like a startup, even though they're having to redo everything. So I think that there are things that happen in terms of a pivot or shift within a company that doesn't necessarily make them a startup, but you might have to go through similar growing pains in terms of what a startup might be. So I guess the way I would define a startup is like an early stage company. And I think that there's a lot of particular sorts of challenges that companies in an early stage have that, again, that maybe are similar to stuff that we go through at Swarm. But for example, Swarm has been around since 2013. There's a lot of brand equity, casework, all kinds of things that we wouldn't have if we were a startup, because we just have so many years of like working experience and past projects that we can point to, and people who come to us because we have done that work before. Whereas I feel like part of the challenge of being a startup generally is having to define what you do and what makes you unique in a world that has no idea who you are, if that makes sense.
I think it does. So for you, it's more about identity and perhaps years in existence, right? Those are some of the big characteristics for you.
Well, I think there's also just, because of the years in business, things that inevitably happen to startups that can cause you to act sort of like a startup. Like where I think a startup typically can differ from an established company, even an established company kind of going through a pivot or through massive changes, is in how they gather revenue. So the early stages startups are, like you said, trying to define themselves in terms of identity, which means that they find it difficult maybe to define who their audience is and how to consistently get customers. So the focus is so much on getting revenue in the door, even more so than building a sustainable model for revenue. It's just get money in the door at all costs is kind of the ethos of a startup. and not necessarily what an established business might look like, which is like, what is the cost of getting that money in the door? And how do we make sure that we do it in a way that sustains us long term? There's a lot of short-term gains, I think, when you're in startup mode that aren't necessarily the same things that you do when you're a more mature company.
I do. So, and I know we wanted to really focus on particularly the pros and cons of being a startup. So I would say too, I think of it not only just as getting revenue in the door, you might think of it as the same, Nate, but more just getting users in the door. Like, what is our user base, which actually may or may not translate to revenue if revenue is actual monetization. Because I think sometimes you end up with these startups that have enormous increase in number of users, but actually don't necessarily see more dollars coming in the door. So, but I think without question, the focus is growth above all else, at least in today's world. So I think loosely we think of startups, and there's this popular term, tech startups, of course, these technology-based companies that do tend to start out very, very small with trying to figure out their identity, trying to find their audience, but also with a very heavy focus on growth. So I think that's sort of a shared understanding we have. And then I think to shift to the bigger question we really wanted to focus on is like the pros and the cons. Now, I also have worked in tech startups. I was at a company called Scroll Motion. I was employee 17. And in the time I was there, we moved to, I think, roughly 150 in terms of employees within 2 years. And, you know, we saw that's relatively rapid growth. So, and, you know, again, some people define startups a little bit more in terms of number of employees, in terms of years of existence. There isn't really one super precise definition, I think, that we'd all agree on. I think it's a more casual term. But broadly, what Nate and I are really talking about, especially here in the technology sector, is, again, these very small companies that are just starting out. Right. So based on that, Nate, what do you think are the real advantages of being a startup?
I mean, we were kind of talking a little bit earlier about wearing a lot of hats. I think at an early stage of a company where, you know, like you said, the focus is kind of on growth at all costs, there isn't so much structure in place, both as a plus and maybe a minus, depending on how you want to look at it. But it means that somebody can kind of come in and make a dent that kind of has a lasting impact in a much easier way than if they came into a more established, larger company. You know, if you come into a company where there already are hundreds of employees, to take your example, just by the sheer numbers, your ability to push forward something that has a significant impact on the company depends on the company, obviously, but just by the numbers is harder to do. It's harder to stand out in a larger group. If you have a smaller company, or even a company that is just at such an early stage where even with a group, you have a lot of different shifting dynamics, I think the possibility to have a lasting impact is greatly increased. So for some people, that's super exciting, like getting in, we should do it this way. And that way is like 180 degrees the way we did it last week. And that's the way we now do it. And that takes us to, you know, 1 million in growth or whatever. And you get to say, look at what we did, like because of this thing that I implemented. That's really exciting to some people who are maybe more entrepreneurial, who want to make that kind of impact and want to work in an environment where things do kind of shift that drastically. But that could also be kind of overwhelming for somebody who, you know, kind of craves structure or wants to be on kind of a known trajectory, maybe doesn't want to have like their job be this massive impact. You know, they just want to kind of come in, do the work that they were hired to do, be paid, and notice that they've done something, but maybe that thing doesn't have such high stakes as it would in a smaller sort of earlier stage company. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I would agree. I would look at it from a slightly different perspective, still sticking to sort of the advantages. And then I think we both see there's pros and cons. And then I think we could dive a little more into the challenges, which I also agree with, by the way. But in terms of the pros, first of all, I think just contextually, sort of a lot of things have happened all at the same time. You know, as we've mentioned in other podcasts, I teach and work about Agile. Nate does as well. And, you know, a real focus on that type of work is not always, but broadly, are really around smaller teams and this idea of moving very nimbly to respond to change in the market. I feel like a couple things have also happened. What I teach another class called Napster to Netflix, where I really talk about what I call the tools of production, right? If you're in the development space, software development, really all you need is a laptop and some access to cloud storage and a few other pretty basic tools that are really accessible to almost everyone at this point in time. So the ability to spin up a company, to spin up a startup is just there's just really minimal things that need to happen. There aren't huge barriers to entry. And, this has long been a complaint certainly in other sectors, but in other parts of the world, right? Places in Europe, they complain a lot about how there's so much bureaucracy. It's so hard to get a company up and started. So I think also, and in addition to that, so first of all, the people themselves are very empowered. And then in terms of, so tools of production are very available, but also tools of distribution, right? Like we do live in a very wired world. Not for nothing, like Facebook has 2 billion users. We are all connected via this one website. It's astonishing. And I wouldn't say that that's where, every tech startup ends up, though I certainly think a lot of it sort of keep it as kind of like the goal destination in their heads. But Nate was talking about how a person at a smaller company could have a really big impact with regards to the company. But I would actually argue, in addition to that a person at a tech startup can just have a remarkably large influence in the world. When Instagram was purchased, it was something like less than 50 employees, and it had I think almost 100 million users at that point. I mean, I think those numbers might be wrong. It might be closer to 50 million, but it was really a substantial number. And something that software itself offers is scalability, right? Like you figure out a software that works for X number of people and you're always increasing your user base, or you're certainly trying to. So I do think this idea of these very fast moving companies that do often focus on the lean model where we really target our audience and then build a very adaptive product in response to this. I think the physical setting of a tech startup in terms of the infrastructure of a tech startup, not that many people, not a ton of operating procedures, I think is all really optimized to do that when it goes well. And I also think, not for nothing, the tech space just doesn't have a lot of regulations, which gets back to that thing sort of about starting up companies when I mentioned Europe. You can put something in the market and you don't have to go through FDA approval. Like it just doesn't exist for us. So outside of pharma stuff, but and a few other examples. But I just meant for a lot of our products, we can basically just launch this website. And I think it is the combination of that. I think it is the access to the markets. I think it's the access to the tools. And I think it's the very nature of how software gets built, that for all of these reasons, how a tech startup works can work very well. And also to what Nate was talking about, it can definitely reward ambition. I mean, when you look at some of the more famous startups we think of, from Instagram to Uber to Facebook, these are all companies founded and dreamed up by relatively young individuals. Nobody, I think, was even over the age of 25. So maybe under 30 at least. And so they saw a problem and they wanted to create a solution. And, I do think there's something to be said for, you don't have to go to meeting after meeting and deal with this bureaucracy and deal with that bureaucracy, whether at a government level or internal to your organization. And you can put something out there that can have tremendous influence very quickly. Even something like the Robinhood app, which just came out not that long ago, it's for individuals to be able to basically invest in the stock market. That is seeing huge upticks right now. So, they said, oh, well, a lot of individual investors don't really get an opportunity to access the markets the way we would like. And so here we are creating this app to do that.
You touched on a lot of ideas there. And part of it is this idea of what is it about sort of working with technology? And I think you're right. It's definitely true that in that world, it's just the scale is very different than opening, say, a retail store in some physical space in the world, right? Where you're limited to people being able to travel in and out from that location, versus what you said with Instagram, where it could start really small and go overnight success, in ways that just weren't possible a generation ago. But in some ways, I think a lot of the allure of the technology startup just echoes kind of a sort of an American entrepreneurial dream. Right? I think there's sort of this idea of if whenever we want, we have in our back pocket this great idea that, if we were given the time and resources, that we could build our own new whatever widget. And that idea of like that kind of entrepreneurial dream of, if I ran this place, it'd be so different, that sort of thing. It really gets accelerated in all kinds of crazy ways because of technology, because you can literally, with one person, Facebook's a really interesting example of that. They started in their dorm room, and you mentioned like starting in the garage. Those stories are so compelling because they're so relatable. Like we kind of start from humble beginnings. Like we've all been in that situation. Like anyone listening to this podcast presumably has access to technology. So that idea of kind of making it such a low barrier to have such a high impact is really kind of alluring from a kind of, I want to say like American dream type standpoint of like, oh, you could be the next Zuckerberg, or you could be the next whatever, it happens to be. And I do think there is something about technology that is alluring from that because the stakes are so much bigger. I think this entrepreneurial spirit might have always existed. And there is something about, I think, Americans that, as opposed to other countries, are a little bit less risk averse, let's say, a little bit more willing to kind of like be interested in jumping in and doing something new or different. There's some kind of drive culturally that we have, I think, in some ways. But I think technology just really enhances that maybe sort of cultural intuition.
Well, I would definitely say I really like the way you talked about it as kind of the American dream or the entrepreneurial dream. The thing I was thinking of was, I read this funny article once. I played soccer my whole life, and this one article was like a world tour of soccer and its relationship to all these different countries. It was in advance of one of the World Cups, so there was an article per country. And they talked about why it never really caught on in America. And they said it's because we're a country of loony but determined inventors. And because we never invented soccer, we just got it from some other part of the world, we are naturally suspect to it, which I thought was quite funny. And, when you mentioned that about entrepreneurial dream, I was thinking of there was a congressional hearing a couple weeks ago now with Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google, the CEOs of all four. And what was interesting to me is their beginning statements, their framing statements of the hearing were really about the entrepreneurial dream, actually. And, they talked about humble beginnings. And I didn't know that Jeff Bezos' mom was pregnant as a teenager and look to what heights he climbed. I mean, yeah, that's pretty remarkable. And, I thought it was fascinating that it was just folded into the fabric of what they were talking about as organizations that have really left startups behind in terms of size and in terms of ownership and in terms of all these different characteristics, brand identity, all the characteristics we're talking about. So, but I would agree. I think it taps into something culturally. And I think it's completely true today. It's so funny because there's so many articles out right now. We haven't had a very good public health response to what's happening currently, saying, oh, America is losing its luster in the eyes of the world. And I think that's true in a lot of different ways. But in terms of the idea of the American dream, in terms of the idea of it being about entrepreneurialism, if I said that word correctly, I think that dream glows as brightly as it ever did, even if in reality it's much harder to achieve. So I think it's something very core to our culture. I would totally agree with that. Mm-hmm. So I think we're agreed on sort of the pros, and I do want to make sure we have enough time. And then in terms of the cons, so what are some of the limits you see with the startup world, culture, environment, organizations?
Well, I think, it's, especially when you're talking about a startup as opposed to an established company, there can be a lot of fits and starts. I mean, like you went through a growth period with a tech startup. I know plenty of people who've gone through a downsizing squeeze, and not that can't happen in a larger company, but the fluctuations are much more rapid at an earlier stage, and especially if the startup is sort of pivoting or still exploring how they're reaching users or trying to find their audience. So there's a fair amount of risk with that, just in terms of like, hey, look, if you go and work for, let's say like a government agency, the state of New York, something like that, you probably have a pension and, like you have like job security because the government has been around for a while. Whereas like with a technology startup, this week they're hiring, next week they're firing, and it can, and also, I mean, even if you forgo job security, maybe you're in a position where you're valuable to the company's focus can shift much more drastically too. I think, in those early stages when the company's still trying to define what it is they're trying to do, it means that like your job can completely change overnight in terms of what you're responsible for. Instagram's an interesting example. My understanding of the Instagram story, and I'll have to look this up in case I'm wrong, but I think it actually started as a game where it was a real estate game where people would take a picture of a building and like buy a virtual building. And because part of the game would require them to take photos, they came up with this idea kind of on a lark to do filters. And so they built filters into this game, and they noticed that everybody was just taking photos all the time and using the filters a lot. And they said, well, this is really interesting. Maybe we should just forget the game and become a photo sharing company, and that kind of shift, if you're a gamer and you want to work for a gaming company and now you're not working for a gaming company anymore, maybe that's going to matter to you. I think that kind of fluctuation, both for the instability financially and the insecurity around your job, potentially, along with like the shifting vision, are you going to be in the same job if you stick with that company a year from now or 2 years from now? People who go through those shifts you mentioned, where you started at a company of 10 or 20 and now it's a company of 200, that's a different company. I mean, there's totally different challenges that are happening now. And that kind of sort of instability is not going to necessarily be attractive to a lot of people, I think.
I'd be curious, since you are, a leader of a company, is there anything particular to startups that you really try to sort of steer clear of? Any sort of behaviors or activities or just sort of ways that they structure? Or like, is there ways you sort of think about how your company can be different than that?
Well, another kind of like big difference between a technology startup and an agency like what we do, even though we work in technology, I mean, like I'm not looking for venture funding. And I think that like, that's one of the kind of unique features of a technology startup, is that you can kind of stay in a startup mode forever because there isn't necessarily, like you said, the goal is growth. And as long as you show growth, people will keep throwing money with the hopes that somehow you'll figure out how to monetize. And you talked about a lot of successful examples, but there's far more failures, right? Where a company, like the lifeblood of any company is that you need capital to operate, right? So you can generate capital by selling goods or services to people and generating a profit, or you can borrow money and hope that eventually you'll figure it out. And I think technology startups, the way we think of them, they're often in that second category of like venture funded, where they overextend on purpose, because, and the idea is like, even if there's 20 failures, that one that succeeds is worth the investment from like an investor standpoint. It still sucks if you're running a company that fails. You could talk all about like fail fast and how much you learn from that. And I agree with all that. I think I've been part of companies that are no more too, and I think there is a lot of value in going through that experience, but it's not necessarily something I would want to repeat continually personally. I find it kind of exhausting, kind of like, kind of going through the process of like raising funds and proving metrics, and it's much simpler, I think, to run a company that generates revenue the old-fashioned way by selling goods and services that people want.
Yeah. I think I was just asking because I was interested, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Like, we mentioned a couple successful examples. What I've heard is that 4 out of 5 startups close before year 5. That's what I heard. Or it might have even been 90%. Like, it was a very, very high number. So the vast majority do. Yep. And you mentioned that story about Instagram. I highly recommend it. There's a really great tech meetup here in New York City. They take a huge hall over at New York University. They used to meet once a month. I'm guessing it's all online now. I haven't checked lately. Anyway, and I had a chance to hear Jack Dorsey speak from Twitter, and it was really fascinating because he was the same thing. They sort of launched some product in the market. It wasn't really going that well. They built out the Twitter as we know it today was essentially an internal messaging system. And people were really responding to it and really liking it. And so they said, well, why don't we cut out all these other pieces and just offer just the Twitter version of it? And it led to where we are today. So a similar story, right? And I think the stories that both Nate and I are describing in terms of product development are the ability to really be responsive to your audiences. And, there's just a lot of case study material at this point in time about how established companies have a lot of trouble doing that. I do think, for better and for worse, many, many huge companies have essentially replaced their C-suite at this point in time with people who primarily are capable of pivoting with large organizations. I think it's become a huge focus. I think things like Nokia, which was a leader in cell phones and essentially disappearing in something like 18 months, is a cautionary tale for all these different industries. I remember a very striking example I saw, which is not a startup, but I think takes from this culture, is the head of marketing for 3 of the major movie studios. There's a pretty textbook way you promote like an Avengers or a Jurassic Park, and all 3 of them were prepared to completely change that, make it much more targeted, social media, etc., to really find their audiences who would actually show up in a movie theater, and were completely prepared that if it worked well for one movie, that doesn't mean at all it'll work well for the next, which is a very, very different way to think about these very expensive $100 million campaigns. So it was sort of fascinating. That gets away from it, but that mindset I do think can be helpful. In terms of the downsides, though, and I agree with Nate on this too, there is also a real physical cost. I mean, it's not only demoralizing, but I think this is a stereotype, but I would say when I think of a typical tech startup that starts with like less than 5 people, typically you have somebody who heads up product, and then you have another person who's your CEO, or maybe it's the same person. And then sometime later, they pick up somebody in operations, maybe way later. Google is kind of a whole story about this, and that they really waited quite some time before picking up, I forget his name, but he became their CEO for quite a while and like really brought in a lot of process when they were getting pretty sizable at that point. And that's sort of like how it goes with a lot of these organizations. And so what I've seen personally is a lot of burnout by very young people who just, because everybody's enthusiastic. I think there's also a mindset about we'll just pour all our time and energy into this. And there's been a lot of cautionary tales that have come from it. One of the former Facebook founders really talked about a lot of like physical health issues he experienced when Facebook was in its early stages, just because, this is all he did. I think Nate again is also from the tech world, but a hackathon, the reason you have a hackathon is it's a real chance to kind of shut out the rest of the world and just focus on a problem and really work with your team and yourself to solve it. But from an operations standpoint, the experience of working for 20 hours isn't actually good for you, right? It's like not good for your health. And when you build an organization around some of these principles, you got a lot of young people who maybe aren't that good at taking care of themselves. And I think I've seen that a lot myself. And, it was actually one of the reasons that motivated me with the work I do now. And so that's just sort of on the personal level. I think, as with all things, I think there's many philosophies and ideas out there that have a lot of value and challenges, and it's a lot about sort of how you do it. And then I think the biggest con with all of tech startups is the potential for incredible impact in the world that maybe wasn't really thought through when it was 3 guys in a co-working space or a garage somewhere, and suddenly now they have millions, if not hundreds of millions of users, and they are having a remarkable impact on the world. And I mean, this sort of gets back to the bigger point again. And when you are growth focused, instead of, say, security focused or stability focused in terms of your product and in terms of your staff, I think there are trade-offs with all of that. So I think just the, growth at all costs is a pretty heavy-duty mindset in terms of like the impact it can have for the people doing the product, sure, but also in terms of how it can impact the world, right? Is it really for the best that there are 2 billion people on Facebook? I mean, there are a lot of arguments against that. It has reached incredible influence. Some say it is leading to, there's actually data around it's promoting extremism. uplifting authoritarianism. Like there's a whole lot of stuff about all of that. White supremacy, pedophilia, you name it. So it just comes with pros and cons. And so to me, one of the biggest risks about tech startups is what they can become. And I think it's certainly a very small percentage that end up actually doing that. But to me, that's like the biggest thing, the biggest con, just that potential. And that there are so little legislative, regulatory, and even ethical guardrails around it. To me, is a big concern. So that's all I would say.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's tough. I think a lot of what you're talking about is true, and we've talked about it in a number of different topics, but I think it's tough to know how much of that is related to the sort of the tech world, sort of the fact that these companies became successful so quickly, which is another, I think, tough thing to consider in this is like you said, a lot of the people leading it didn't know what they were getting into. And because companies can have such a massive impact in such a short span of time, I think that that's something that's just going to keep being a potential kind of unknown. Who knows whether these people that were in front of Congress are the right people to be running these companies that have such a major impact. Maybe it should be a different person now that they're at a different scale. But
and two of them are. Right. Two of them are not, and two of them are. And,
right.
I just think what you mentioned government. I think at this point in time, I think we can reasonably say a government job is the most stable thing there is, right? All these other industries have seen upheavals from academia to it's very uncommon that you're a lifer at IBM. I mean, getting back to IBM where we started, right? Like IBM did a real gutting of middle management a couple decades ago. IBM has a whole agile academy literally about transforming their workforce, in which time they also laid off yet another 2,000 middle managers. At least that's what I heard. So right. and they're just trying to keep up with the times. I think just my broader concern actually across both is, and tech startups I think work really well if you have a lot of freelancers, if you have young people, like what does sustainability look like across all of it? Individual level, product level, societal level. That's remains interesting to me. So,
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's arguable. I mean, we were talking about the definition of startups, just whether they care about being sustainable. I think at an early stage, companies often don't.
Yeah, and then suddenly they become this huge thing, which again is it's a little bit like a lottery card. Like, I mean, I think the odds are better than that, but there are 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, let's say, that you're really going to become something big. But if you're only worried about short term, what does long term even mean? So, because some of them do become long term. Now, they get outsized attention given the number of companies that don't, but it's just worth thinking about. And then finally, just one, I know we're at 30, but one last thing I thought was interesting is there was a piece this week about how tech startups are continuing to enjoy venture capital funding despite what's happening in the broader economy. There was this piece in the New York Times, and it said, while the stabilization has created a surreal disconnect between tech startups and the broader economy, while retailers, restaurant chains, and many other companies are filing for bankruptcy and are dealing with one of the worst downturns on record, the tech industry has largely sidestepped the worst of the destruction. Demand has surged for startups that offer virtual learning, telehealth, e-commerce, video games and streaming, and software for remote workers. Startups in areas like fitness or children's activities also quickly adapted their offerings to go viral. Virtual, sorry. I mean, it could also certainly be something around timing, but it sounds like there's going to be more of this rather than less. And this was actually true even back in 2016, that a phenomenal amount of the new business growth in the United States is concentrated in the tech sector. Like some incredible percentage. So it's actually quite hard to get backing for a new restaurant, but there's a pretty clear channel to do it, especially if you've done it before for your next seamless app startup. So I think that's kind of interesting for the future.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot to think about. Well, thank you, Eve. I appreciate all your thoughts on this topic. Hopefully we got through some of those questions about what is unique about being part of a technology startup. But let people know how they can be in touch with
Thanks.
you.
So I'm Eve, and if you go out into Facebook at facebook.com/little owl with a 1 at the end, so OW1, I have all my latest classes and information listed there, and also at littleowl.us.
And I'm at Nate Cooper on Twitter. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.